The Douglas A-20 Havoc was an American attack light bomber intruder aircraft of World War II. It served with several Allied air forces, principally the United States Army Air Forces, the Soviet Air Forces, Soviet Naval Aviation and the Royal Air Force of the United Kingdom. Soviet units received more than 1 in 3 of the DB-7s ultimately built. It was also used by the air forces of Australia, South Africa, France, and the Netherlands during the war, and by Brazil afterwards. In British Commonwealth Air Forces, bomber attack variants of the DB-7 were usually known by the service name Boston, while night fighter and intruder variants were usually known as Havoc. An exception to this was the Royal Australian Air Force, which referred to all variants of the DB-7 by the name Boston. The USAAF referred to night fighter variants as P-70. Design and development. In March 1937, a design team headed by Donald Douglas, Jack Northrop and Ed Heinemann produced a proposal for a light bomber powered by a pair of 450 horsepower Pratt & Amp Whitney R985 Wasp Junior radial engines mounted on a shoulder wing. It was estimated that it could carry a 1,000-pound bomber load at 250 miles per hour. Reports of aircraft performance from the Spanish Civil War indicated that this design would be seriously underpowered, and it was subsequently cancelled. In the autumn of the same year, the United States Army Air Corps issued its own specification for an attack aircraft. The Douglas team, now headed by Heinemann, took the Model 7A design, upgraded with 1,100 horsepower Pratt & Amp Whitney R183 twin Wasp engines, and submitted the design as the Model 7B. It faced competition from the North American R-40, the Stearman X-100 and the Martin 167F. The Model 7B was maneuverable and fast, but did not attract any U.S. orders. The model did, however, attract the attention of a French purchasing commission visiting the United States. The French discreetly participated in the flight trials, so as not to attract criticism from American isolationists. The Air Corps, which controlled the aircraft's development, but had been excluded from negotiations between the French, the Production Division, and the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, was directed by the White House on 19 January 1939 to release the DB-7 for assessment in contradiction of its own regulations. The secret was revealed when the Model 7B crashed on 23 January while demonstrating single-engine performance. The French were still impressed enough to order 100 production aircraft, with the order increased to 270 when the war began. 16 of those had been ordered by Belgium for its aviation militaire. Although not the fastest or longest-range aircraft in its class, the Douglas DB-7 series distinguished itself as a tough, dependable combat aircraft with an excellent reputation for speed and maneuverability. In a report to the British Aeroplane and Armament Experimental Establishment at RAF Boscombe Down, test pilots summed it up as, has no vices and is very easy to take off and land. The aeroplane represents a definite advantage in the design of flying controls. Extremely pleasant to fly and maneuver, ex-pilots often consider it the favorite aircraft of the war due to the ability to toss it around like a fighter. The Douglas bomber night fighter was extremely adaptable and found a role in every combat theater of the war, and excelled as a true pilot's aeroplane. When DB-7 series production finally ended on 20 September 1944, a total of 7,098 had been built by Douglas and a further 380 by Boeing. Douglas redesigned its Santa Monica plant to create a mechanized production line to produce A-20 Havocs. The assembly line was over a mile long, but by looping back and forth fitted into a building that was only 700 feet long. Man-hours were reduced by 50% for some operations. Production tripled. Operational history. France. The French order called for substantial modifications, resulting in the DB-7 variant. It had a narrower, deeper fuselage, 1,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R183OSC3G radials, French-built guns, and metric instruments. Midway through the delivery phase, engines were switched to 1,100 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R183OS3C4G. The French designation was DB-7B3. The DB-7s were shipped in sections to Casablanca for assembly and service in France and French North Africa. When the Germans attacked France and the Low Countries on 10 May 1940, the 64 available DB-7s were deployed against the advancing Germans. Before the armistice, they were evacuated to North Africa to avoid capture by German forces. Here, they fell under control of the Vichy government and briefly engaged the Allies during Operation Torch. After French forces in North Africa had sided with the Allies, DB-7s were used as trainers and were replaced in frontline units by Martin B-26 Marauders. In early 1945, a few DB-7s were moved back to France, where they saw action against the remaining isolated German pockets on the western coast, British Commonwealth. The remainder of the order, which was to have been delivered to France, was instead taken up by the UK via the British Purchasing Commission. In the course of the war, 24 squadrons operated the Boston. It first entered service with RAF Bomber Command in 1941, equipping No. 88 Squadron. The first operational use was not until February 1942 against enemy shipping. On 4 July 1942, United States Army Air Forces bomber crews, flying RAF Boston aircraft, took part in operations in Europe for the first time, attacking enemy airfields in the Netherlands. They replaced the Bristol Blenheims of No. 2 Group RAF for daylight operations against occupied Europe until replaced in turn by de Havilland Mosquitoes. Some Havocs were converted to turbine-light aircraft which replaced the nose position with a powerful searchlight. The turbine-light aircraft would be brought onto an enemy fighter by ground radar control. The onboard radar operator would then direct the pilot until he could illuminate the enemy. At that point, a Hawker Hurricane fighter accompanying the turbine-light aircraft would make the attack. The turbine-light squadrons were disbanded in early 1943. Soviet Union. Through Lend-Lease, Soviet forces received more than two-thirds of version A20B planes manufactured and a significant portion of versions G and H. The A-20 was the most numerous foreign aircraft in the Soviet bomber inventory. The Soviet Air Force had more A-20s than the USAAF. They were delivered via the ALSIB air ferry route. The aircraft had its baptism of fire at the end of June 1942. The Soviets were dissatisfied with the 4.30 caliber Browning machine guns, themselves only capable of firing at a top rate of 600 rounds per gun per minute, and replaced them with the faster firing 7.62 mm caliber Schgast capable of up to 1800 rounds per gun per minute. During the summer of 1942, the Bostons flew ultra-low level raids against German convoys heavily protected by flak. Attacks were made from altitudes as low as 33 feet and the air regiments suffered heavy losses. By mid-1943, Soviet pilots were very familiar with the A-20B and A-20C. The general opinion was that the aircraft was overpowered and therefore fast and agile. It could make steep turns with an angle of up to 65 degrees, while the tricycle landing gear made for easier takeoff takeoffs and landings. The type could be flown even by crews with minimal training. The engines were reliable but sensitive to low temperatures, so the Soviet engineers developed special covers for keeping propeller hubs from freezing up. Some of these aircraft were armed with fixed forward cannons and found some success in the ground attack role. By the end of the war, 3,414 A-20s had been delivered to the USSR, 2,771 of which were used by the Soviet Air Force. Variants Boston I and AMP-2. The Royal Air Force agreed to take up the balance of the French order, which was diverted to the UK, and the bombers were given the service name Boston, with the further designation of Mark I or Mark II, according to the earlier or later engine type. Havoc I. The aircraft was generally unsuitable for use by the RAF since its range was too limited for daylight raids on Germany. Many of the Boston Mk2, plus some re-engined Mks, were converted for nighttime duties, either as intruders with 2,400 pounds of bombs, or as night fighters with AIMK IV radar. These were known collectively as Havoc Mki. A total of 181 Bostons were converted to Havocs. In interdiction raids, Havoc intruders caused considerable damage to German targets. Havoc Pandora. 20 Havocs were converted into intruder aircraft, carrying the long aerial mine. An explosive charge trailed on a long cable in the path of enemy aircraft in the hope of scoring a hit. Trials conducted with lone Handley Page Harrows dropping LAMs into the stream of German bombers were not successful, and the Havocs were converted back to Mki intruders. Havoc I turbine light. Havoc fitted with a 2,700 million candela searchlight in the nose. The batteries for it carried in the bomb bay. A radar operator sat in the after fuselage. They were unarmed, and they were supposed to illuminate targets for accompanying Hawker Hurricane fighters. But in practice the conspicuous light made them easy targets for German gunners. A total of 31 aircraft were converted. DB-7 Air Havoc II. The French Purchasing Commission ordered 200 more bombers, to be fitted with 1,600 horsepower Wright R2600A5B twin-cyclone engines. These were designated as the DB-7A by Douglas aircraft. None of these were delivered before the fall of France, and they were sent to the UK instead. These were converted into night fighters by the addition of 12 0.303-inch machine guns in the noses and extra fuel tanks. They had a top speed of 344 miles per hour at higher altitudes. A total of 39 aircraft were used briefly as turbine lights. DB-7B Boston III. The DB-7B was the first batch of this model to be ordered directly by the Royal Air Force. This was done in February 1940. These were powered by the same engines as the DB-7A with better armor protection. Importantly, these had larger fuel tanks and they were suitable for use by the RAF as light bombers. This was the batch for which the name Boston was first assigned, but since the DB-7S intended for France entered service in the RAF first, the aircraft in this order were called the Boston Mk3. Among other combat missions, they took part in the attacks on the German warships Scharnhorst, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen during the dash through the English Channel and the raid on Jet. 300 Boston III were produced and delivered, and some of them were converted for use as night fighters. A variation on the DB-7B Boston III, built for a French government order and featuring French instruments and secondary equipment, of the 480 DB-73s, ordered by France. 240 were built by under license by the Boeing Company in Seattle. None were delivered. Due to the fall of France, the DB-73 block was ordered by the RAF, after conversion to the Boston III configuration. However, following the German invasion of the Soviet Union, 151 DB-73s were provided to the USSR. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a further 356 DB-73s were taken up by the USAAF, which transferred 22 to the Royal Australian Air Force for use in the Southwest Pacific Theatre. Australian sources usually list these aircraft as DB-7B, DB-7C. This was the Dutch Indies Air Force version intended for service in the Dutch East Indies, but the Japanese conquest of the East Indies was complete before they were delivered. Part of this order was stranded in Australia in the so-called Lost Convoy, and the first 31 Bostons were assembled at Richmond Air Base in New South Wales and flown by No. 22 Squadron RAF during the campaign against Buna, Ghana, and Lae, New Guinea. The assembly of these 31 bombers was hampered by the fact that the manuals and instrument panels were printed in Dutch. The rest of this order were sent to the Soviet Union, which received 3,125 of the Douglas DB-7 series. When shipments to the UK finally resumed, they were delivered under the terms of the Lend-Lease program. These aircraft were actually refitted A-20Cs known as the Boston III. The original American indifference to the Model 7B was overcome by the improvements made for the French and British, and the United States Army Air Corps ordered two models, the A-20 for high-altitude bombing and the A-20A for low and medium-altitude combat. Both were similar to the DB-7B. The A-20 was to be fitted with turbo-supercharged Wright R2600-7 engines, but these were bulky and the prototype suffered cooling problems, so the remainder were completed with the two-stage supercharged R2600-11, 59 as P-70 fighters and 3 as F-3 reconnaissance aircraft. One A-20 was evaluated by the U.S. Navy as the BD-1, while the U.S. Marine Corps flew 8 as the BD-2. A-20A. The U.S. Army ordered 123 A-20 as with R2600-3 engines, and 20 more with the more powerful R2600-11. They entered service in the spring 1941. The Army liked the A-20A because of its good performance and because it had no adverse handling characteristics. 9 of them were transferred to the RAF in 1943. The USAAF used the British name Havoc for the A-20A, while the RAF referred them as Bostons. A-20B. The A-20B received the first really large order from the Army Air Corps, 999 aircraft. These resembled the DB-7A rather than the DB-7B, with light armor and stepped rather than slanted glazing in their noses. In practice, 665 of these were exported to the Soviet Union, so only about one-third of them served with the USAAF. A-20C. The A-20C was an attempt to develop a standard, international version of the DB-7 A-20 Boston, produced from 1941. It reverted to the slanting nose glass, and it had RF2600-23 engines, self-sealing fuel tanks, and additional protective armor. These were equipped to carry an external 2,000 pounds aerial torpedo. A total of 948 were built for Britain and the Soviet Union, but many were retained by the USAAF after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Soviet A-20s were often fitted out with turrets of indigenous design. A-20G. The A-20G, delivered from February 1943, would be the most produced of all the series, with 2,850 built. The glazed nose was replaced by a solid nose containing 4 20mm Hispano cannon and 2 50 in M2 Browning machine guns. After the first batch of 250, the less accurate cannon were replaced by more machine guns. After 750 aircraft had been built, a power-driven gun turret fitted with two 50-in machine guns was fitted, with the fuselage 6 inches wider as a result, and the ventral tunnel gun changed from a 30-in to another 50-in Browning. The power plants were two 1,600 horsepower R260-23. Many A-20Gs were delivered to the Soviet Union. US A-20Gs were used on low-level sorties in the New Guinea theater. A-20H. The A-20H was the same as A-20G, continued with the 1,700 horsepower R260-29. 412 of these were built. The takeoff weight was raised to 24,170 pounds. ZB-20H. In 1948, the last surviving A-20H in United States service was redesignated B-20, with the elimination of the A for attack category, and was given the Z prefix as being obsolete. A-20J, Boston IV. The A-20J carried an additional bombardier in an extended acrylic glass nose section. These were intended to lead bombing formations, with the following standard A-20s dropping the bombs when signaled by the leader. A total of 450 were built, 169 for the RAF, which designated them Boston MKIV from the summer of 1944 onwards. A-20K, Boston V. The A-20K was the final production version of the A-20 series, the same as the A-20J except for R260-29s instead of 23s. In October 1940, the USAAC felt a need for long-range fighters more than attack bombers. As a result, 60 of the production run of A-20s were converted to P-70 night fighters, all delivered by September 1942. They were equipped with -540 Seychelles rupees radar, the glazed nose often being painted black to reduce glare and hide the details of the radar set, and had 4 20mm forward-firing cannon, each provided with 120 rounds, in a tray in the lower part of the bomb bay, while the upper part held an additional 250 gallons fuel tank. In 1943, between June and October, 13 A-20Cs and 51 A-20Gs were converted to P-70A. Differences were to be found in the armament, with the 20mm cannon package replaced by an A-20G gun nose with 6 50-caliber guns installed. The -540 Seychelles rupees radar installation being carried in the bomb bay with a vertical plane, twin dipole arrowhead, transceiving antenna protruding between the nose guns. Further P-70 variants were produced from A-20G and J variants. The singular airframe P-70B1 and subsequent P-70B2S had American centimetric radar fitted. The P-70S and P-70S saw combat only in the Pacific during World War II and only with the USAAF. The P-70B1 and P-70B2 aircraft never saw combat but served as night fighter aircrew trainers in the U.S. in Florida and later in California. All P-70s were retired from service by 1945. F-3A. The F-3A was a conversion of 46 A-20J and K models for nighttime photographic reconnaissance. This variant was employed in the European theater by the 155th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron, which began its deployment as the 423rd Night Fighter. Squadron. The 423rd was converted to its photo mission as the 155th Photo Reconnaissance Squadron, in part because of knowledge of night fighter tactics which could be used to defend against German aircraft. Although the armament was removed, the crew of 3 was retained, consisting of a pilot, observer, and navigator. The first Allied aircraft to land at Itazuki, Japan after the August 1945 surrender was an F-3A. 1A-20A was bought in 1940 by the United States Navy for evaluation for use by the United States Marine Corps. The Navy, Marine Corps did not have any priority on the production lines, so the BD was not put into service. In 1942, 8 former Army A-20Bs were diverted to the United States Navy for use as high-speed target tugs. Despite the addition of the target towing equipment and the removal of all armament and the provision to carry bombs, the aircraft were still designated BD in the bomber sequence. An observation, reconnaissance version of the A-20B powered by two 1,700 horsepower R2600-7 engines. The original order for 1,489 aircraft was cancelled and none were built. Operators: Australia, Brazil, Canada, France, Netherlands, South Africa, Soviet Union, United Kingdom, United States. Survivors. Specifications. Data from War Thunder. General characteristics. Crew. 3. Length 47 feet 11 in. Wingspan 61 feet 4 in. Height 17 feet 7 in. Wing area 465 feet squared. Empty weight 15,051 pounds. Loaded weight 27,200 pounds. Max takeoff weight 27,200 pounds. Power plant 2 times Wright R2600A5B twin cyclone radial engines 1,600 horsepower each. Performance maximum speed 339 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. Range 1,050 miles. Service ceiling 23,700 feet. Rate of climb 2,000 feet per minute. Armament: guns 6 times fixed forward firing, 5 inches Browning machine guns in the nose, 2 times flexible 0.5 in Browning machine guns mounted dorsally, 1x flexible 0.5 in Browning machine gun mounted behind bomb bay. Bombs 2,000 pounds. Notable appearances in media. The Way to the Stars, also known as Johnny in the Clouds, is a 1945 war drama film made by Two Cities Films and released by United Artists, that prominently features Ralph Boston's